Good afternoon to those who are following us from Europe. Good morning from those who are following us from the other side of the ocean. Welcome back to the fifth and the last installment, so to say, of this workshop. Today, we are going fundamentally to wrap it up with a topical discussion on national conceptions and national traditions of constitution making and how they relate with European integration and more focused, I would say, European Union constitution making. Now, very quickly, the program for today is the following one. We will have Marco Dani and Agustin Menendez first. Then we will have Mike Wilkinson. Then Joanna Mendes will discuss these two papers. Then Bruce Ackerman will react to the discussion, and then the speakers will have the right again to react to Joanna and Bruce, and then we will open it up to discussion. Finally, the event will be wrapped up by the conclusions by Bruce Ackerman. Two important things. The first one is that, unfortunately, Jan Komarek cannot be with us. And this is really a pity because he had sent a really insightful and challenging and rich paper. This means that the event will last basically 30 minutes less. The second point is a reminder that participants and speakers to the workshop can actually address questions with the audio, while the others, the attendants, for privacy reasons, fundamentally, they can interact by using the chat. And I invite them, actually, if they have questions, to already send them while the speakers are actually presenting their papers, and then later, I will basically read them aloud to the speakers or to the discussants or to Bruce Ackerman. Now, first things first, we will have Marco Dani and Agustin Menendez. Marco Dani is not only the host of this conference, but is also a professor of comparative constitutional law at the University of Trento. Agustin Menendez is a professor titular, I think one say, at the University of Maggio Complutense. Floor is yours.
Many thanks, Marco. Many thanks also to all the participants, the happy few made it until the end of these 5 days of webinars. In this paper, we try to engage with the two main claims made by Bruce Ackerman with regard to the European integration process. Let me remind them in a nutshell. The first one, Ackerman argues that the difficulties encountered in establishing a pan-European constitutional democracy are the consequence of a European constitutional diversity. That is, to the fact that the leading European nations belong to 3 different legitimacy pathways. The second claim, the constitutional treaty, according to Ackerman, was a missed opportunity to bring about that project. Had the constitutional treaty been approved, the Union would be in a much better position to cope with the crisis of the last decade. Let me state openly that we disagree with both claims, although we think that they may contribute to advance our discussions on the nature and future of the European integration process. In the paper, we put forward 3 counterclaims. The first one, the difficulties associated with national constitutional diversity, in our view, are overstated. European constitutional orders may also be seen as converging towards a predominant legitimacy paradigm, that of the democratic and social constitutional state. The second counterclaim, the ratification of the constitutional treaty, would not have made much of a difference in dealing with the crisis of the last decade. It would have neither equipped the Union to act in more decisive ways, nor would have modified the neoliberal direction in which the Union has consistently proceeded since the end of the 1970s. Third counterclaim, in order for the Union to recover from its ongoing legitimacy crisis, its neoliberal bias should be redressed. Perhaps the COVID-19 crisis could offer a window of opportunity in this regard. In this presentation, I'm going to explore the first claim and leave to Agustin the task of illustrating the other two. So what is our take on Ackermann's three pathways of legitimacy theory? In the paper, we start by saying that it is highly valuable, that it provides a powerful argument to challenge and overcome some reductionist accounts of post-World War II European constitutional state. According to these latter views, the constitutions enacted in Europe in the aftermath of World War II resulted from politically diminished constitution-making processes and give rise to highly constrained democracies. Ackermann's reconstructions of constitution making in Italy and in France offer an entirely different image of the post-war European constitutional state. The Italian constitution is the product of unprecedented political mobilization, but also the case of France is noteworthy. Neither the political parties giving rise to the 1946 constitution, nor de Gaulle in 1958 were afraid of the people. In either case was democracy highly constrained. Think to the 1962 referendum and the capitulation of the Conseil constitutionnel in front of the constitutional amendment pushed forward via referendum by de Gaulle. And yet the theory comes also with serious limits in our view. First of all, it exaggerates the importance of the origins of the constitutional order, as if its entire life cycle were encoded in the genetic moment. Second, the theory is not open to the hybridization of ideal types. Think the case of Hungary discussed yesterday, a constitutional order starting under the elite pathway and proceeding after the 2011 reform in the revolutionary mode. Most importantly, for the sake of our argument, Ackermann's theory seems to neglect that legitimacy owes considerably not only to the origins, but also to the goals and the capacity of a constitutional order, a regime, we could say in Ackermannian vocabulary, to respond to social concerns. By situating constitutional systems into different and apparently self-contained boxes, we risk to overlook the possibility of identifying common themes and institutional solutions shared by constitutional systems across their respective pathways. If we follow this approach, centered on the goals, the social concerns, the regime, we may argue alongside and not in opposition to Ackermann's theory that the European post-war constitutional systems converge towards a single predominant paradigm, that of the democratic and social constitutional state. So what are the main features of this ideal type? First of all, this ideal type displays a clear aversive dimension. It repudiates totalitarianism, communism, and laissez-faire constitutionalism. Second, the ideal type includes also an evident aspirational dimension. The democratic and social constitutional state, in our view, adapts and entrenches a set of commitments inspiring New Deal constitutionalism. The influence of the latter owes both to the geopolitical prominence achieved by the United States after the war and to its reputation. The New Deal was one of the few interwar experiences that succeeded in reconciling capitalism and democracy. So ironically, we may trace a linkage between Ackermann's last chapter and the democratic and social constitutional state, in that Europeans succeeded precisely in what the Roosevelt administration failed to achieve, the constitutionalization of the New Deal. The influence of New Deal constitutionalism on the democratic, social, and constitutional state is visible in what we consider the four foundational constitutional commitments of the latter. They are mass democracy, constitutional rights, activist government, and multilateralism. I do not have time now to go into a detailed analysis of this point, but if requested, later on I will offer some example on how the democratic, social and constitutional state picks up and develops New Deal leitmotifs. One last point prior to leaving the floor to Agustin. Once situated within the European integration process, the democratic and social constitutional state plays an ambivalent role. On the one hand, it can be viewed as a source of inspiration for the EU iconography. The Union has constantly borrowed from the experience of the democratic and social constitutional state principle and institutional solutions to legitimize its institutional setting and its policies. However, on the other hand, the democratic, social and constitutional state has also been a target of the neoliberal transformation promoted via EU policies since the 1970s. But on this point I stop, and I leave the floor to Agustin, that is going to reconstruct the dynamic concerning European integration in relationship with the democratic and social constitutional state. Thanks for the attention. Agustin, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Marco. I think two claims are pending. The first is that in order for the Union to recover from its ongoing legitimacy crisis, its structural neo-ordo liberal bias should be redressed. And the second is the ratification of the constitutional treaty would not have made much of a difference in dealing with the crisis of the last long decade. Now, substantiating these two claims requires engaging with the analysis of the substantive content of the fundamental norms organizing public power in Europe, which I refrain from referring as a constitution. In particular, we have to pay attention to, one, the foundational ambivalence of the European communities, two, the socio-economic and political context which led to such ambivalence being resolved in favor of turning the communities into an external enabler, un facilitatore esterno in Italian, of the social and democratic state, as it was in the 60s and the early 70s, and three, through a legal and political mutation to show how the European Union became an external constraint on the democratic and social state, as it has been in the last 40 years. So to proceed, the first is to remind all of us of the deep ambivalence of the founding treaties. And basically, there were two basic ways in which the treaties could be developed, taking into account what was negotiated and what was written into the treaties. The first was to turn the European communities into an external constraint on national political decisions, ensuring the discipline, or ensuring through the European Community law, the discipline that in the pre-war period, in the before the First World War and after the First World War, had been guaranteed through different mechanisms, including the gold standard, the free movement of capital, and liberal constitutionalism. That was option one. Option two was to turn the European communities into an external enabler, casting the international conditions under which democratic and social states could thrive. If you wish, in legal terms, it was a choice between economic freedoms being constitutional meta standards that would allow to reestablish a liberal economy, to quote Charles Meyer, recasting bourgeois Europe redux, or to characterize economic freedoms as formal rights to equal treatment, basically non-discrimination, which did not require any specific substantive outcome, and as mandates to the political process to facilitate further trade integration in a way respectful of national political autonomy. And on that second option were basically, or we can find basically the Christian Democrats, the Gaullists, and the Social Democrats, of course, with different emphasis. So there was this ambivalence, and this ambivalence could be solved in different ways. In the 60s and the 70s, and I'm going very quickly here, more details on the paper, the European communities became basically an external enabler. And this was also the result of national political processes and the situation in the national political spheres, reconciling economic integration with the enhancement of national autonomy to design different socioeconomic policies. Key on that regard was the fact that economic borders were not eliminated, but rather rendered porous. Movement of goods and persons was cautiously enhanced, while limits were retained on capital movements. This meant that political and economic integration proceeded pari passu, with political integration mastering economic integration. Key in that regard was the fact that community decision-making required the constant unanimous agreement of the member state, not least thanks to Charles de Gaulle. But that was the 60s and the early 70s. What happens in the 70s, and again, I have to go extremely quickly, is that the background conditions that allow for this fashioning of the European communities into an external label cease to apply. The slowing down of rates of growth, combined with the unbalancing of an international monetary order premise on the continued capacity of the United States to remain a benign hegemon, among other reasons, because foolishly, the Europeans have renounced to the monetary infrastructure that had been created with the European Payments Union in 1950, gave way to monetary, economic, and fiscal turbulences. This resulted in a major challenge to the post-war consensus on the activist state and on the democratic and social constitutional state. And this paves the way to the transformation of what was an external enabler into an external constraint that was pushing structurally into a neo-ordo liberal direction. The basic change that happens here is that there is the rise of two assumptions. First is that we move from common money to single money, and then we move from a common market to a single market. From the common money to the single money basically happens not in 1992, 1993, but happens much earlier in 1978 with the European monetary system, which basically introduces a divorce between fiscal and monetary policy and results in monetary policy being depoliticized and entrusted to an independent central bank, a solution that allured European politicians because it seemed to offer a convenient way out of their entrenched political disagreements about how to create a common monetary infrastructure. This was not 1992, this was 78. The way in which this was done was to create a pegs between European currencies, and this basically implied that all monetary policies were to be anchored to the monetary policy of Germany, which, as a result of contingency, unset-mindedness, and cunning, was the only country in which monetary policy was in the hands of an independent central bank. So well before 1992, de facto, monetary policy in European states was in the hands of an independent central bank, the Bundesbank. The change in 1992 is that it is put in the hands of a common central bank, the European Central Bank. The second shift is the one from a common market to a single market, and this results in interpreting economic freedoms into the operationalization of private property and entrepreneurial freedom, turn into a substantive yardstick of validity of all national norms, including, of course, those playing a vital role in the development of the democratic, social, and constitutional state. This is what is confusingly referred most times as the constitutionalization of European law, that economic freedoms can be the criterion on the basis of which the validity of national norms is decided. I will only add here that it's important to notice that neoliberals and ordoliberals were cunning enough to resort to the formal neutral language of the development of European law. The scholarly paradigm of integration through law, whatever the normative commitments of its main advocates, ended up being a fellow traveler in that regard, as it assigned a key autonomous role to law at a time at which the political will to deepen integration was portrayed as waning. The persistent lack of interest of European law scholarship for politico-economic issues, which are usually not regarded as being part and parcel of core European law, is largely the consequence of this depoliticization of law, and of course, what is wrongly labeled as European constitutional law. Now, the tension between the democratic and social state and the European Union law was already there. It was dissimulated for quite a long time by the upswing of financialization, which in the EU took the specific form of an asymmetric monetary union that for 10 years led to fake convergence between North and South through unsustainable trade superhabits, record private indebtedness, matched by reckless cross-border lending. The full implications of the shift of the European Union from external enabler to external constraint were only visible in the wake of the 2007-2008 crisis. Losses were allocated in such a way that the value of capital was preserved and burdens were shifted to workers, pensioners, and welfare recipients. While the radicality of the distributive choices requires taking into consideration ideology, resort to internal devaluations as an adjustment mechanism was a choice stemming from the fundamental norms organizing public power in the EU, from the Maastricht so-called constitution, if you wish. Enter the coronavirus crisis, and we are confronted with arguments saying that perhaps what has been said so far is not completely wrong, but things now are different. And they are different because austerity policies have been discarded, suspension of fiscal rules, role of the ECB as unconditional lender of last resort, and because we are witnessing, and today they are again, because Poland has ratified the recovery, the EU Next Generation, we are going through a Hamiltonian moment, which is problematic in many ways, but very clearly what it points to is that there is an important common expenditure package coming, backed up by joint issued debt. But what we have, and we do not have a crystal ball, we don't know where the EU will be moving, but what we can see is that so far what has happened is that debt has been issued. That is not so unproblematic. The role of the ECB as unconditional lender of last resort is far from being unproblematic from the standpoint not only of the rule of law, but also of democratic accountability. This is where the German Constitutional Court gets it basically right. If only because, contrary to other central banks, like the Banque de France or Bank Italia before the 70s, the ECB would have acquired the power to decide on the monetization of public debt without being subject to any kind of democratic control. That's a big democratic black hole. The second is state aid has been massively produced because the rules have basically been suspended, but in very asymmetric ways. Germany, more than 1 trillion euro, some states barely any aid. This is an accident waiting to happen in terms of the disequilibria that it introduced into the market. The recovery fund is certainly significant, but is too little, far less than 1.5 of the GDP per year for 3 years, and it comes too late, more than 1 year from decision to implementation, and moreover, it will imply the return of a strict conditionality. So, what we can say is that on the one hand, it's too early to tell if austerity has been diminished. So far, exchequers have absorbed losses, and there are no plans regarding the final way in which the costs will be distributed. Any mention to taxes remains basically problematic, and the Commission only last week basically postponed plans regarding corporate income taxation at the European level to 2023 at calendas grecas. Two, some argue that what was decided constitutes the embryo of a significant supranational exchequer with redistributive capacities. But for that to be the case, there will be a need of major political transformations which are not obviously in sight. And were they to be, they could still be stopped in the tracks, among other actors, by the German Federal Constitutional Court. It is telling in that regard that the regular budget of the European Union has been reduced. Equally revealing, I insist, is the fact that the agreement did not extend to the creation of new supranational taxes to fund the transfers contained in the package, besides the minuscule plastic tax. But if that is so, I think that we have clearly shown that the European Union keeps being structurally biased as a result not only of politics, but as a result of the fundamental norms organizing public power in Europe in a neo and ordoliberal direction. And this would not have been changed by the constitutional treaty. We could discuss this on the questions and answers part of the seminar, but I would conclude saying two things on that regard. The first, as is quite obvious, substantively speaking, the constitutional treaty has been turned into the Lisbon Treaty. So there are no basic fundamental changes that have not been made part of the law, and they have not equipped better the European Union to deal with the crisis. And the second question, paradoxically, is that the great democratic achievement of the Lecken process was the fact that the French and the Dutch voted no, exerted their democratic right to vote, and rejected the treaty. That was a ratification failure, but a democratic success. And this was then basically rejected by the members of the Council of Ministers and of the European Council by means of pushing forward for Lisbon. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Marco and Agustin. Now it's the turn of Professor Mike Wilkinson, who is a professor at the London School of Economics. I want also to add that Mike has a forthcoming book, which is actually, given the topic of this conference, both topical and timely, which is titled Authoritarian Liberalism and the Transformation of Modern Europe. Mike, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Marco. Thanks for the invitation to this conference. I'm going to keep my camera off if that's okay, but I will turn it on later. The title of my paper is Europe's Long Interregnum, Constitutional Moments Without a Constitutional Moment, with capitalized in the last iteration and a question mark. And I think, in fact, by the time I get to the final draft, the question mark will be dropped and it will be more assertive, constitutional moments without a constitutional moment. I'm not going to try and present the written paper in its entirety, but to offer rather an overview that engages a little bit more directly with Bruce Ackerman's pathways, and also a little bit with Marco and Agustin's paper. But this also makes life a little bit more difficult for Joanna, because I'm going to be going somewhat off script. So although I don't agree with the overall picture that Bruce Ackerman's gives, it does provide a useful heuristic for certain distinctions and fine-grained analysis. And I'll mention both where I find it useful and where I disagree. In some sense, my assessment is more sweeping than Bruce Ackerman's, in contrast to some of those who asked for more complications of his analysis. But in some sense narrower in the sense that my focus is resolutely European, and I make no claims about anything beyond Europe or about global constitutionalism, or about constitutionalism in any other part of the globe. So I'm going to do four things. Firstly, I'm going to say briefly why I disagree with the overall argument in the longue durée. I'm going to take a dive into the different pathways and note an important agreement, and I'll signal that at the start, namely the dominance of the elite pathway, a version of what I referred to as authoritarianism, but I won't justify that label here. Then thirdly, given that dominance of the elite pathway, I need, I think, a different account than Ackerman gives of the difficulty in finding a common pathway to a more perfect union. In other words, my explanation for the absence of a constitutional moment with a capital C and a capital M, and for the growing disconnect, so it's not only an absence of a constitutional moment, but a growing turbulence and even counter moment from below, which finally fails, but which tells an important story. And by way of coda, if I have time, I will talk a little bit about the growing phenomenon of authoritarian populism, as it's often called. I'll start then with my overall thesis, which is that what Bruce Ackerman in the book refers to as revolutionary constitutions are better understood in the European context, I repeat, as counter-revolutionary. They are over time reactionary, conservative, as opposed to transformative revolutions, despite maybe even because of the inclusion of self-styled revolutionaries, such as Togliatti. The communist parties of Europe gradually left behind any revolutionary ambitions, and in fact, in some cases, rather quickly left behind any revolutionary ambitions. In other words, it is the Gasperi's grip more than Togliatti's turn that stamps itself on the post-war settlement. And I say this not only with hindsight, but I believe this was also understood at least by certain commentators at the time. This counter-revolutionary thrust, and I emphasize that it's not something which occurs immediately, but over decades, is consolidated by European integration and the move to grand coalitions, and eventually the collapse first of Eurocommunism, and then of social democracy, more recently in the so-called PASOKification of social democratic parties in the last a decade or so. Now, of course, we can tell an interesting tale of the demise of the Spanish, the Italian, and the French communist parties, and then the various social democratic parties. And if we wanted a more nuanced story, that would be important. But in a sense, then why does it matter whether these are revolutionary or counter-revolutionary? Is this just a question of tomato, tomato? And it's not, because if I am right, we can make sense of the longer trajectory in a way that avoids Martin Lauchlin's quite accurate objection of a certain circularity in periodization, when T1, T2, T3, and T4 are essentially abstract and devoid of content. We can find them anywhere and everywhere. If we give them some content in the Hegelian or Marxist sense, we can provide a longer trajectory which makes sense of one linear narrative, but not strictly linear, of course. In other words, Marxist terms, although I'm not attached to that label, the long 19th century, during the long 19th century, with the march of the masses onto the stage of history following the French Revolution and the revolutions of 1848, this culminates with the interwar breakdown, the first interregnum, followed by a series of reactionary responses in the post-war period to tame the perceived threat of democracy. Based on this diagnosis, and I argue in the book, at least in part, a misdiagnosis of interwar breakdown as caused by a crisis of democracy rather than a crisis of capitalism. But that's a longer story. In other words, this is appositely captured in the notion of constrained democracy, this post-war settlement, or in Christoph Moller's phrase, we are afraid of the people, and in Bruce Ackerman's own terms, the elitist path. Now, I maybe here just briefly point a disagreement with Marco, not so much necessarily in the Italian context, but certainly in the German and French contexts. It was well understood in the 50s and 60s already that this was a period of decline of parliamentarism. Otto Kirchheimer writing in the late 60s, has already noted, not only in the German context, but also in the French, the ideological demobilization of the masses. In France, from the Fourth to the Fifth Republic, the professionalization of party politics, what he calls the catch-all party, later on is developed in more recent times by Peter Meyer, but Otto Kirchheimer has already diagnosed this depoliticization in the 1960s. It's noted by others, it's noted by Hannah Arendt, by Karl Jaspers. By 1979, in the words of Herbert Marcuse, Eurocommunism had become the true reflex of existing power relations. But all of these parties, from center left to radical left, had tied their flag to the mast of integration and renounced any revolutionary ambitions. The project and process of European integration is not the origin of this, but it consolidates this counter-revolutionary or reactionary initiative and is deepened by the turn to constitutionalism, juristocracy, the supranational iron cage, which is already been discussed by Agustin and is entrenched in the 80s and 90s through EMU. More recently, what is interesting in the last decade is that this has created conflict, both systemic conflict in the case of the German Constitutional Court, OMT, and vice jurisprudence, but also has generated anti-systemic political and social movements, most notably in the case of Greece, which I'll say something about in a moment. So my first overall thesis, which would take longer to make out in detail, is that the post-war revolutionary constitutions are consolidated counter-revolutionary constitutions. Now, point two, at a more concrete level of analysis, of course, there are significant differences, which requires a more granular analysis. And I found very useful Bruce Ackerman's distinction between the Italian and the French traditions based on the significance of de Gaulle as the military figure, which of course was lacking in Italy precisely because there was a desire to move away from the military strongman after the reaction to Mussolini. So we can tell very important distinctions. But I want to focus rather on the commonality, the common path, which is this gradual dominance of the elite, in Ackerman's terms, the elite pathway. And I'm happy to use that term, although I'm not attached to it. This is the dominance of a certain legal constitutionalism, if you like, with the rise of constitutional review, counter-majoritarian institutions, including, of course, significantly the German central bank and then the European Central Bank, culminating in German order liberalism. And that, of course, has a significant material impact because of its impact on the Maastricht rules. In fact, just to quote Ackerman, what he calls the elite construction, in his view, predominates in the European Union. This elite path, which although is associated with the German constitution, comes to be more generally pervasive, in part through the constitutionalization of the treaties, comes to a head in the Euro crisis phase because, to put it simply, it comes up against the political and social reality, which is demanding something very different. It's demanding more economic intervention. It's demanding, of course, the ECB to be much more discretionary and proactive. And yet, which of course in turn triggers a number of challenges by the German Constitutional Court, but is curiously unresolved in the final analysis. There are, in other words, a number of constitutional moments, but no constitutional moment. Not only because of the different pathways, but for reasons that go to what I call the material constitution of the European space. Now we can argue about precisely what that includes. Does it include the UK? Does it include Scandinavia? I'm going to bracket that discussion and just move to point three, which is to spend a little bit of time saying why, or giving my explanation for the the absence of this constitutional moment with a big M. And there are three things to consider, and I have to be quick here. One is the political form of the EU, or what we might call interstate relations. The second is the regime, the form of regime in the European Union, what I call state-society relations. And third is the social and political movements. The first point I'll make quite quickly, which is that the German model attains only a semi-hegemonic status in the period after Maastricht, as referred to by Hans Kundnani as a geo-economic semi-hegemony. It's geo-economic rather than geopolitical because of the absence of military power, and it's only semi-hegemonic because Germany is dominant enough to upset the equilibrium, particularly after the reunification of Germany. It upsets the equilibrium in the Franco-German partnership, but Germany does not become dominant enough to resolve the contradictions. So dominant enough to upset the equilibrium, but not dominant enough to resolve the contradictions and play a leadership role. And there's an interesting body of scholarship here in the IR literature, which looks at the form of a federation, theories of the federation going back through to early 20th century German scholarship, and indeed in a more global context, Charles Kindleberger, who argues that this is the reason for the collapse in the interwar period was the lack of a global hegemon. There isn't, in other words, within the European Union, a state which can exert a determining influence within a federation. And indeed, the idea of semi-hegemony goes back to Ludwig Deyo. But I will move to the second part of this section, which is to think about the regime. To understand the Euro crisis phase and its irresolution, we need to not only focus on the past decade, but the post-Maastricht period, where the EU becomes both more contested and more aloof. It's often forgotten that already in 1992, the French, in the Petit Oui referendum on Maastricht, vote by 51% to 49%. And in the paper, I develop an argument made by Marcel Gauchet, the French philosopher, already in the early 1990s, that this was a sign of a growing disconnect between the elites and the people. So this phenomenon of populism that is often traced to the last few years goes back at least to the early 1990s and the growth of the Front National from that period. But there is a strange disconnect. There is of course, with the fall of the Soviet Union, the end of history, etc., etc. But not only in the sense of Fukuyama, but also in the sense of Habermas, who reneges any revolutionary emancipatory projects. The only thing that we can do is tame capitalism from within. And of course, the turn to global and cosmopolitan constitutionalism is exemplified in that movement. There is, in other words, an elite consensus, and that's typified precisely by the uncoupling of monetary and economic policy that Agustin talked about, but a growing popular dissensus signaled not only by the Petit Oui, but various other referenda, and then, of course, the French and Dutch rejection of the Constitutional Treaty in 2005, by which time, as Vivian Schmidt points out, there is a systemic disconnect where the member states engage in politics without policy, and the EU engages in policy without politics. Underlying this apparent disconnect is a deep resentment, popular discontent, but also the turn, of course, to third-way social democracy, which adopts most of the market strictures of economic liberalism, Blair, Schroeder, Jospin. And we can talk about the decline of social democracy in Scandinavia, which was brought up in the discussion on Wednesday. What about the social and political movements? Why does this need to be brought into the equation? Well, if the EU hardens through the Euro crisis in terms of its project of market liberalization, which is now imposed, not through merely constitutional law, but through emergency politics, conditionality arrangements, the troika's imposition of conditionality in turn for credits and central bank discretion, we also have a narrowing of ideological consensus noted by Tusk, Donald Tusk. I quote Tusk in the paper where he claims order liberalism has become the only game in town. This isn't new, but it is a deepening of longer standing trends. The democratic reaction, in Mioni's words, moves from the well-known democratic deficit of the EU to what he calls a democratic default through the Euro crisis phase. Etienne Balibar calls it a revolution from above. Again, I say this is really a counter-revolution through a series of fudges, the kicking of the can down the road, as Varoufakis calls it, buying time, in Streeck's expression, and not, as the new constitutionalists claim, the resolution through the ECJ of judicial supremacy. What was new in this period was the brief flicker of contestation from below in the form of Syriza, in the form of an potentially anti-systemic movement from below, anti-austerity, but pro-European, followed by the event, or rather non-event, of the Ochi referendum, when in 2015 the Greeks voted in a referenda against the conditionality programs, and Alexander Tsipras subsequently capitulated to an even harsher set of conditions. This is a stark symptom of a broader decline. We are still afraid of the people. Again, we can tell a more granular story about the Greek constitutional path, the decline of PASOK, the turn to Eurocommunism, and the abdication of responsibility for a serious plan B to leave the Euro, with the honorable exception of Kostas Lapavitsas. But it speaks to a more general trend of depoliticization and abdication of the principle of popular sovereignty. So to conclude, where are we left? With what are we left with? So we were left without a constitutional moment, perhaps with the sort of the non-event of the Ochi referendum, which could have been a constitutional moment but wasn't. And instead we have from above this series of fudges, which I think still continues, as Agustin suggested, in the recent pandemic response. There is not yet a Hamiltonian moment, but also a new phenomenon of authoritarian populism, what emerges out of the conjuncture then and builds on the absence of a rupture of the type that probably would require leaving the Eurozone, if not the EU, is this strange combination of authoritarian liberalism from above and authoritarian populism from below that engages in this dance of the tango, where you have von der Leyen deploying populist rhetoric in an attempt to suppress it, emulating the populism of Orban and the Polish populists in this these rhetorical gestures where neither side is seriously interested in building democracy, but both are interested in the other because it gives them an electoral enemy to gesture towards. In other words, we are still afraid of the people. And there I will conclude. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. So now is the turn of Joanna. Joanna is a professor of comparative administrative law at the University of Luxembourg. She's going to discuss the two papers that have been just presented. Joanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marco. My connection just gave me, my system just gave me the sign that my connection isn't stable at this very moment. So let's hope that this will work out well. Thank you very much for the opportunity to discuss these papers and for the papers, really. They raise a whole range of issues that I cannot possibly address in my comments. From the nature of the trajectory of the EU's political regime, cannot address fully in the richness, that's what I mean. From the nature of the trajectory of the EU political regime, the possibilities of changing the current relationship between politics and law in the EU, and the possibilities the eventual possibilities to reinstate the political. This is not addressed in the papers itself, but it's a theme that comes from the papers. And Morjan's paper, on which maybe I will still make some remarks at the end in the linkage with these discussions on the possibilities of critique of EU constitutionalism. So I will touch on some of these points. I will leave many others to the interventions that will come afterwards. And this is not a way of escaping the difficulties in which Mike just put me. I hope, at least. Let's see how this goes. You'll pick it up, Mike, in case I don't do justice to what I just said. So my purpose is less to give a specific feedback on the papers, on each of the papers, but rather to link them as a way to stimulate discussion between them and on them, and indirectly, more indirectly in my interventions and directly also on Bruce Ackerman's interpretation of EU's constitutionalism and of its constitutional moments. I will be essentially, obviously, confronting the papers of Mike and of Marco and Agustin, which I think they stem from a common position vis-a-vis where EU law stands right now and of the features of its political regime as it stands now. So a common diagnosis of the degree of entrapment, so to speak, in which the EU finds itself. But they reveal clearly a different understanding of how the EU got to the point of entrapment in which it is today. They both papers emphasize the importance of trajectories rather than of constitutional genesis, despite Mike's reference now to what could have been the moment, the constitutional moment with Greek hockey, I think it's pronounced. But they also suggest that if there is a decisive moment to make sense of the challenges that EU faces today, that if there is such a thing, and that's not their focus, in my reading of their papers, that would be Maastricht and not the failed ratification of the constitutional treaty as Bruce Ackerman has defended. But the analysis of Marco and Agustin on the one hand and the analysis of Mike, they diverge on the significance of Maastricht. And because they diverge on the significance of the EU, or on the nature of the EU political regime. For Mike, the Maastricht era was a prelude that announced what was coming, what came after. But it merely emphasized what he said also now in his intervention, a long process of depoliticization that has been favored, enhanced by EU integration, but that began in the post World War II EU constitutional settlement. The EU consolidates, that's what he said now, consolidates the counter-revolutionary thrust of EU constitutionalism. That was the argument that he made now. So from this reading, Maastricht signifies the closing down, the confirmation of the closing down of political alternatives to economic liberalism. But this was already preconized clearly in the EU integration process since the outset in his reading. Whichever changed in the 1990s and the early 2000s, that those changes did not significantly change the material constitution of Europe that had been there since the outset. Maastricht only signaled a growing disconnect between the elitistic path and the social and political demands that came from below. On Marco and Agustin, and then I will come to the questions after this contrast of the two papers. On Marco's and Agustin's reading is different. For them, the current challenges lie in the shift that the role of EU law has had in relation to the democratic and constitutional state, and both said it now, the shift between from being a constitutional enabler to becoming an external constraint that is contrary to the policies that the democratic and social constitutional state would demand, would require. And here, in this point, they coincide with, in this contrast, they coincide perhaps with Mike's analysis, but they stress the combination of the liberal components of the EU integration project since the beginning with the components of deep economic intervention that enable the EU to support rather than constrain the model of democratic and social constitutionalism that was shared by most member states. So Maastricht was a turning point, but a turning point that began much earlier, and they make that quite clear in the paper. Began with economic and financial transformations at the end of the 70s, and with the legal anchoring of market integration as it evolved since the late 70s. And they mention in particular the Cassis de Dijon in this regard, but also the establishment of the European monetary system. And then the political economic context of the 90s and 2000s that supported clearly the legal and institutional developments that led us to where we are today, to the neoliberal political regime that the EU enshrines. So in both analyses, the constitutional treaty is a detail in this trajectory, is a detail in this evolution. Marco and Agustin clearly argue why, and I'm not going to repeat that. Agustin mentioned that also now in the presentation. If anything, it would have only entrenched even further. If anything, it would have only entrenched even further this collision route on which the EU found itself already from a few decades before with democratic and social constitutionalism. Now, these different analyses and perspectives, they engender different views on the possibility to overcome the EU crisis and the challenges that it faces now. This is not something that comes very clearly from Mike's paper or from his presentation. This is more my reading of it, and again, from the contrast between the two papers. But it is also an aspect that was mentioned in passing by Agustin, and it is a point that I would like to explore. So where do we move to from here? Where do your analysis lead us as we move forward? And here the divergences, I think, appear again. So authoritarian liberalism on Mike's reading, and Mike, please correct me then if I'm wrong, you will have the opportunity to react, emphasizes the preclusion of alternatives, emphasizing this systemic character of the disconnect between the elite establishment and the social and political demands that come from below, that is enshrined, in your view, in the EU's genetic code, so to speak. The emphasis, on the other hand, the emphasis on the EU's relationship with the democratic and the social and with the democratic and social constitutional state is more nuanced in this respect, precisely because it explores the enabling, constraining dynamic of EU integration. On Mike's point, I had prepared, or I had thought of a point of discussion that you've already answered. So I was going to propose a possibility for discussion. I'll just outline it here, ignore it because you've already replied to that, is whether one could see authoritarian liberalism as corresponding to one stage of European integration, but that is clearly not your view. My question would be rather whether the whole of EU law and the whole of EU integration can be read from the prism of authoritarian liberalism. That would be more the question that I would have to you as a basis then for discussion. To Marco and Agustin, or based on Marco and Agustin's paper, my question, and I'm not sure if this, well, it is a question to you, yes, I'm not sure, but it's a question for discussion clearly, is the extent to which the EU can still become an enabler of national constitutional commitments, or in a sense, have these national constitutional commitments become, in the meanwhile, so enmeshed with EU's commitment to neoliberalism that democratic and social constitutionalism has been eroded also within the systems, to the point that the question that I've just asked, whether the EU can still be an enabler, loses sense, or put in other terms, is there still room for a dialectic there, a dialectic there? And if that is the case, are there any elements that would help in devising today anything like the regulatory ideal of democratic and social constitutional state? Well, it's perhaps a bit too dramatic the way I'm putting this, but your analysis refers to the past trajectory and to the past relationship with democratic and social constitutionalism, which is still formally enshrined in most constitutions. But the question that I'm asking really is whether it's still there materially as a basis that then can, as a constitutional ideal that could still serve as a yardstick in a possible dialectic between the EU and the national. Or to put it in a different term, is such a constitutional ideal, and this goes back in a sense to the diversity that Bruce Ackerman emphasized, but in a different way, is such a single constitutional ideal possible in a continent with different varieties of constitutionalism? And I'm using here the expression that Signe Larsson has aptly used. Is there any such a constitutional ideal that could have the role that democratic and social constitutional state has had in the past for a community of 6, for a community of 9, and even for a community of 12? One that does not preclude possible alternative economic views from being democratically chosen? Or does the problem only lie on the lack of political actors to convey these political alternatives to the status quo? These remarks, in a sense, raise the question of constitutional imaginaries, and this is where I was going to link to Jan's intervention. I'm not going, obviously, to debate Jan's paper at this point, but I would just like to highlight something that I find important in his intervention that also links or can be useful also to the debate, which is the way he emphasizes the importance of semantics, and he emphasizes the problematic reinterpretation of concepts of democracy and constitution in the debate on the debate on EU's legitimacy, which marked the transposition of EU law, the transposition to EU law of a statist way of thinking about public law, one that EU administrative law has also very much strengthened, and that transposed to the EU what Martin Luglin has called in one of his writings, I think the towering metaphysical status of government and law. So this frame of thinking that now, whether we like it or not, is present in many aspects of EU law. And this process of constitutionalization of language has largely coincided with the neoliberal turn that in different ways Mike's paper and Marco's and Agustin's analyze. And perhaps it has hindered the development of EU law, or it has hindered the possibility of other pathways of developing EU law, if not other pathways of establishing the foundations of a political regime. Let's put it like that. So the constitutional discourse, in a sense, has provided, as it has been used, it was used perhaps to provide a sense of direction that proved misguided, but it is by now also a part, it has transformed also EU law and creates a mixture that it's hard to detach, or it's sometimes hard to detach. And this is something that I wanted to raise. There are many other points the papers and that the papers raise that definitely merit discussion. The link between the American New Deal and democratic and social constitutional state, that's a very rich analysis in Marco's and Agustin's paper. The link between authoritarian populism and authoritarian liberalism that Mike mentions in his paper and also mentioned now in the presentation. But there are others here in the audience that are more qualified than I am to engage in those debates, so I will refrain to go in there. I think, just concluding, the papers are rich in many respects, but also because the points on which they touch, they are key to understanding, in my view, they are key to understanding what type of political regime the EU can still become. What it is, I think the papers clearly agree. And by that, they are essential also to addressing the capacity of EU law, or to regenerate the capacity of EU law in a sense to respond to the social concerns on which its authority actually lies. So I very much look forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks a lot, Joanna. Now it's Bruce's turn to react to both papers and also to Joanna's comments.
Well, let me begin first by emphasizing common ground, and then moving to several disagreements. The first and a very fundamental agreement was expressed by Augustine, but also is very much Mike agrees with this, and that is to reject the classical system of comparative law, which emphasizes, so far as the European continent is concerned, Hans Kelsen's distinction between law and politics. And that the law is the law, and it has to be understood as a discipline fundamentally different from politics or anything like that. No, says both of these papers, and also the one that unfortunately has been given. No. We need some other larger framework that incorporates politics, democracy as part of our understanding of the structure of authority. And moreover, that's number one. The second fundamental agreement is that we should not, we can only understand the present from the vantage point of the longue durée, of a number of generations. Going back to the French Revolution and the Industrial Revolution, and the introduction of masses into the political life of the countries of Europe. I completely agree with that. As I mentioned yesterday, the only reason that I'm focusing in this book on the post-war period is to keep my task manageable. Not because what happened before is irrelevant, not at all. I am, one of the things that this conference has really helped me out. It's going to take me another year or so to actually write and finish the volume 2, and this is one of the many things that I've gotten out of this, which requires my clarification when I actually put my rather primitive draft at the present time into publishable shape over the next year or year and a half. So both of those things we agree with. Moreover, I agree that the development of the market economy over the last 70 years is of fundamental transformative significance. I would urge you to distinguish between the two dimensions of this dynamic as we think about Europe. One is the world dynamic. So the US and Europe are declining economic powers. China and India are rising economic powers. The percentage of the world GDP of the United States at the end of the Second World War was 50% of the entire GDP. Depending on how you count, it's 15, 18, whatever. I mean, there are a lot of, we could talk about it. A European share of the world GDP, if you add Europe and the United States together, it's in the 20s. If you look at China, what is that? Well, the numbers, it's complicated, but it's clear. You look at India, these are growing very substantially. Japan, etc. Russia is a declining economic power. So part of this process of economic transformation doesn't necessarily have to do with capitalism. Whatever we want to call about, what do we want to say China is? I wouldn't call it capitalist, unless we, unless that term loses all content. We need a more rich vocabulary. However, then there are other problems having to do with, and Europe by itself and America and Europe by itself cannot solve those problems. We have to respond to them. How? Big question, which should be analytically distinguished from the other question, which is how can Europe determine, insofar as it can, its political and democratic principles? All right, so that's, we're in agreement here. Now, as well. Now, perhaps given the time, I should move to a disagreement that is clearest in Mike Wilkinson. I think, Mike, this is I'm a person who has thrown out quite successfully a number of terms which then are appropriated by others for their own purposes. So I don't want to say that you've misused your understanding constitutional moment, this is the best way to do it, is different from mine. Welcome to the club. There are 42 other people who have developed the term constitutional moment in ways that I do not accept. You're one of them. But let me explain the point. Constitutional moment is the typical time frame of a constitutional moment is a generation, not a week or two. and it has a number of different phases. I elaborate them more elaborately in my book on transformations, and once again on the civil rights revolution. We can call the first one signaling, where a movement for fundamental revision in the system of government is actually taken, is victorious enough so that it's taken seriously by the present regime. Oh, I should mention, if I haven't, with the third very important commonality is all of us emphasize the regime, not the court. We put the court in the regime, and not have a constitutional law that focuses on judicial opinions. Judicial opinions are sometimes important, but it's the regime which is the fundamental element of analysis. So that's another very central unifying point. Where a constitutional moment, however, often is a failed constitutional moment. A movement moves to the signaling stage and is taken seriously and actually gains a victory, and then, however, it doesn't sustain itself and is rejected through self-conscious voting decisions at a later point in time. Or it may move to the takeover stage, where the actual movement party, which is the key conception in organizational charisma, as was developed by yesterday and the day before, actually takes control of the government and proceeds to elaborate its program, and then wins or loses. If it wins several times, it goes to the consolidation phase. Okay, at where, you know, history has no end. The end of history is, I think that is, I reject that notion, and so do all of us. Even when a regime is consolidated, that isn't the end. Rather, a new movement party may arise, and they signaling, et cetera, and so forth, and successes or failures, all right? So it's that 4 or 5 stage process we can, should be kept in mind when we start going back to where we disagree in our history. So let us go back. I'll begin with 2 words. François Mitterrand. In 1981, now François Mitterrand, one of the other things that I'm going to mention in more focus on in my concluding remarks is we have to take the European context, and we have them, more seriously than state by state. Charles de Gaulle is repudiated in 1948, and no one in 1958 on January, the public opinion polls in 1958, which were more reliable than they are today, I should say, because people answered the telephone. The percentage of the population that was supporting Charles de Gaulle in the beginning of 1958 was 7%. There was a coup d'etat That's what brings de Gaulle into power. And that is authoritarian. Francois Mitterrand is the leading opponent of this authoritarian coup d'etat, and runs against de Gaulle for the presidency, and does amazingly well. De Gaulle is repudiated in 1968 through a series of referenda, which I describe in the book. This is a constitutional moment that actually succeeds in repudiating authoritarianism. But, and Mitterrand is organizing throughout the 1970s. And as you know, we don't have to go through all of the French politics, and finally comes into power, wins in 1980 on a strong socialist platform, and proceeds to implement it. How then he doesn't, then he's resisted and this is a constitutional, this is significant. To say that the process of neoliberalism is foreordained by something that happened, whatever it may be, before the 1980s, has to confront this mobilized social democratic movement of the very kind that you value, and its significance. And then at this time, then the second key moment that I want to just, obviously we have, I just want to challenge the idea of predestination at this point. The next key moment is 1990. What is going on right then? A revolution, a mobilized movement by the East Germans and the West Germans breaking down the wall. This is part of a world revolution extending to Beijing. This is not foreordained that it's going to lose. You really have to be a Marxist to think that. Of a very pessimistic Marxist, I should say, which Mike Wilkinson isn't. Now, what does Helmut Kohl want to do? He wants to buy the revolutionaries in the East by his one Deutschmark for one Ostmark deal. But in order to do that, he has to get the consent of the President of France. The crucial decision is not, you were saying before, oh, there's this development, et cetera, and so forth. The crucial question is whether, why am I suppressing his name? It must be some, Jacques Chirac is going to give his consent, because under the post-war settlement, he has to give his consent as one of the occupying powers to Deutschmark that goes that includes East Germany, and he refuses. He says there has to be a European central bank and a euro. And in December 1990, Kohl agrees against the consent, unilaterally repudiating the head of the German bank says no. He said, and an unprecedented action, he said, Kohl says, yes. Now, this is unconstitutional. Under German law, Germans let it go because the German Constitutional Court is insisting at that time on having a new constitutional convention, as is required by the Schluss article. All that I'm saying is there's nothing here that's foreordained. The idea that it happened to be a Chirac who had just come in after Mitterrand's defeat, second term, just come in. We don't, so this thought that there is this ineluctable dialectic that is led to the present day is, I quite agree. We have to understand that something really remarkable has happened. What caused the crisis of 2008? Wall Street. Not anything that happened in Europe. It was not for the first time in the 1970s. There was a crash on Wall Street. And Europe had to take the consequences, among other places. And that's just the same thing that happened in 2008. You are reeling under this economic crisis generated not by the German bank, but by Wall Street. Now, it is perfectly true. And this is, how many more minutes do I have?
You have 2 minutes, Bruce.
2 minutes, fine, thanks. It is perfectly true, and I want to emphasize my agreement with Mike Wilkinson, that there is the problem of Germany, the economic powerhouse with 20% of the population of Europe, generating ortho-liberalist doctrines and imposing them through the European Central Bank in ways that go far beyond the Lisbon Treaty. Far beyond the Lisbon Treaty. And you're absolutely right about the Greek episode. But the thought that it is that we can understand the existing crisis as imposed by ordoliberalism. Ordoliberalism is a symptom of the German problem, which is, as we have, as many have noted, goes back since the time, from the time of Bismarck, when he beats what used to be the hegemon of Europe in 1870, generating the Paris Commune, and ultimately, only in the 1880s, the first successful republic on the continent of Europe since the French Revolution, with the Italians moving in that direction as well, but in a different path. So the crucial point here is to say that this conversation is too Eurocentered. And fails to understand and appreciate, and the American conversation is too American-centered. When I say, it's India and China which are the rising economic powers, not the United States, they say, they're accept the premise of hegemony, world hegemony, which is no longer accurate. But you, for perfectly understandable reasons, because you're focused, this conference is focusing on Europe, I want to, and my contribution, as it were, is a knowledgeable person on Europe, but who is an outsider. Thank you very much. I hope this has helped.
Thanks, Bruce. So now we will have the reactions, first from Marco and Agustin, and then from Mike.
Okay, thanks, Marco, and thanks to Joanna and Bruce Ackerman for the comments. I would like to answer briefly to three topics, three questions that emerged in the discussion so far. The first actually was raised by Mike, who described the post-war constitutional state, if I understood well, as not the result of a revolution on a human scale, but even counter-revolutionary. And I must say, I have often disagreements with Mike in this regard, because probably I'm less politically and theoretically ambitious than he is. But I find this strange to accept. Why is it so? Because it's basically saying that Keynes is counter-revolutionary. Maybe he was a reformist, maybe he's not revolutionary as you probably would like, but to say that Keynes and constitutionalism that was the infrastructure for Keynesian policies in the Trent Gloriose is counter-revolutionary strikes me as a rather exaggerated judgment. Those are the years in which all the things that have been dismantled since the end of the 70s were built, basically. Nationalization in France, planning, the healthcare system in Italy, the empowerment of trade unions. All those were things that were encoded in the constitutions adopted post-war World War II, and that were slowly implemented. And to say that that was counter-revolutionary, I'm wondering what was the real revolution if those were counter-revolutionary. Second point related to what Joanna was asking. At a certain point, she asked, where do we move from here, where here is the current situation, the current stalemate, if you want, of European integration. And connected to this, I would like to touch upon also the question that Martin Laughlin was appropriately making, which is how do we move from here? Because I think that that is the first issue that we have to touch upon. The debate for today is about how we move, and probably the destination is the debate for tomorrow. How do we move from here? I think that we move from, you can give two answers. The big problem is, of course, the formal constraints posed by the treaties. Unanimity is required and ratifications, and as Martin observed a couple of days ago, there is also the pending threat of the German Constitutional Court. I could provide two answers. The first, the most optimistic, would be an Ackermanian answer. The moment in which we have formal constraints or an amendment procedure, which is very difficult to amend, you go for the informal amendment procedure, informal changes of the Constitution. And informal changes of the Constitution can be brought about, we learn, through precedents of courts and landmark legislation. But all of this require a strong political party movement. Now in Europe, we don't have a strong political party movement. That's why I'm also surprised by Professor Ackerman's analysis in the book, because I would expect for Europe this kind of analysis to emerge. And there's nothing like that instead in the book. That was my surprise, I must say. There's no political party movement either for a federalizing upgrade of the current state of the union, but there's no political party movement also for the coordinated dismantling of the union. That's why we remain stuck in the middle of, in this interregnum, as Mike was saying. So how can we change the situation? I think that the European Union in the last decades have experimented with a way to amend its treaties and to change them. Of course, not in a dramatic way, but still in a significant way. With these methodologies, without strong political movement parties bringing about change, but by experimenting policy solutions that at a subsequent moment are codified in the treaties. Perhaps, but this is, I agree, of course, with what we said in the paper. This is the attempt that they are doing with Next Generation Europe. Try to put there some experiment and to see that if it works, then it can be entrenched in a treaty amendment. But of course, this is still premature to say. Final point, still Joanna was saying, is the democratic social constitutional state still there as an ideal? I think so, because for all the changes we have noticed, the policy changes in the last decades, the evacuation of parts of the welfare state, of course, although there are still structures which requires to be defended, the symbology of the democratic, social, and constitutional state has not been challenged, with one notable exception, the notable exception being the president of the ECB, Draghi, who dared to say that the European social model was dead at a certain point of the previous crisis. But apart from that, the iconography and the ideology, if you want, or the constitutional imagination related to the democratic and social constitutional state is still there, probably because it is considered still with some authority, with some traction. Of course, the more the time passes, the more the power, the authority of that project is threatened. And I will stop here.
Agustin, do you want to intervene?
Thanks a lot. I think I will proceed very telegraphically because time is running very quickly. I think Stefan Auer raised the question of ordoliberalism. I can say on the one hand that very obviously that figures out in the paper in two ways. One is because the ordos were key players pushing into the treaties the ambivalence to which we were referring. They were in favor of a European community, or European communities that would be an external constraint on what had been decided at the national constitutional level, what they regarded basically as a defeat at the national constitutional level. And this was not, and I think, of course, it's very important, the work of Christian Jorges, that I don't know if he's among the audience today. Of course, Christian's work is fundamental, but it's also fundamental to keep in mind that the ordoliberalism is not only a German phenomenon, it's a European phenomenon. Jacques Rueff is not usually characterized as an ordoliberal, but the kind of views that he was holding are similar, and you can find them also in Italy. Then it plays a key role, and then we could build bridges with Mike's position, because what it proposes, basically, ordoliberalism, is a politics without politics. So the whole idea of the neutral power comes back into the European political vocabulary, so to say, thanks to ordoliberalism, and even if monetary union is not what ordoliberals wanted, because they thought it insufficient in many ways, the image of the myth of the independent central bank is very much related to this idea of neutral power and politics without politics. Now, Martin's first question, how we got there, how was it possible that given the apparent convergence on the democratic and social state, the European communities turned neoliberal? I think a key part of the answer is that by 1971-73, with the monetary and economic crisis, Europe, the European communities had become integrated enough so that national policy responses affected all, but not integrated enough as to be able to take sensible common solutions. This basically resulted, and I think Fritz Scharf has been fundamental in illuminating that, into what was regarded as something essentially positive, meaning joint decision-making, revealing itself at the same time as a trap. So what is and keeps being the source of democratic legitimacy for the European Union, that national executives democratically legitimated are taking the fundamental decisions, becomes also in functional terms a trap. That trap of joint decision-making is what turned neoliberalism without neoliberals possible. I think Bojan is in his question pointing, I disagree with the assessment of Delors, which I think is regarded as one of the most enlightened European leaders. I think history might treat him differently. But the key question here is that there were not so many neoliberals or ordoliberals in power in the European communities. How is it possible that neoliberal, ordoliberal ideas succeeded? Is because they were able to present as apolitical and alluring as leading to further integration their solutions. So you needed a common monetary infrastructure. You were not agreeing politically on how to manage that common monetary infrastructure. It's very tempting to listen to people that says you don't need the state. You can do it without the state. You can do it in many ways in an apolitical fashion by means of creating this neutral agent. And I think this is very much the story of the single market. I think Delors retrospectively said, oh, we will create the market and then the political demands will come. He was totally wrong on that regard, because the market, so-called, I mean, we are talking about capitalism, not the market economy here. The financial infrastructures were created, but the political demands did not follow. And I think in a nutshell, that's the story of how this shift was made possible, because it was alluring at a certain point to follow that recipes, precisely because there was no political agreement on how to proceed, which I think proves the point that the origin of the constitutional problems in the European Union is not related to different constitutional trajectories, is related to different visions, different socioeconomic visions incarnated in the 70s by the position of Germany or the Netherlands on the one side, and the position of Italy, Great Britain, or France, and then, of course, the United Kingdom shifting in many ways position after Thatcher comes to power in a very quick way, which also proves that Britain could be sustaining different political positions within the European Union, no matter what is the constitutional trajectory that did not change. Finally, on the question of reform and where to head that Joanna was pointing, I would only like to add that I think, and this partially overlaps also with the second question of Martin, I think that what it seems to me quite clear is that without rupture, there is no way out, because the problem is not the political orientation of the Commission or the Council of Ministers. The problem is that neo-ordoliberal ideas have been hardwired into the treaties and into European Union law. And the majorities in order to amend the treaties and European Union law, and a majority within the court in order to revert the jurisprudence is unlikely. So you need rupture. And in order for rupture to happen, I think that the constitutionally wise way of doing that is by recognizing that we have a massive conflict, as we were trying to point, between the national constitutions that keep on reflecting the ideals of the democratic and the social constitutional state and European Union law. There is a conflict. You cannot at the same time realize the program of the Italian constitution and the program that is stemming from the European Union treaties. Then you have to rely and insist on what the national constitutional law says, which remains the supreme law and the source of validity of European law. And you have also to use the layers of European law that still correspond to the national, to the democratic and social constitutional state friendly type of layer, so to say. Thanks.
Mike?
Thanks very much. I'll try and be relatively quick so we have time for discussion. So first, Joanna, thank you so much for engaging, not only with the written paper, but also with the comments and my bigger project. And I won't talk too much about that. Maybe just to say that to understand authoritarianism in this sense of a lack of alternatives requires both an institutional analysis of the type which looks at the interplay between courts and legislative and executive branches, but also a more informal analysis of what you referred to via Jan's paper as the constitutional imagination. And in the book, I also distinguish between a more passive form of authoritarian liberalism, which is the post-war settlement, and the more active forms that emerged through the Euro crisis, and indeed in the first iteration in 1930, that when Hermann Heller first diagnoses authoritarian liberalism, it's a much sharper, brutal in some ways version with the bypassing of parliament through the presidential cabinets. But even then, in conjunction with the so-called toleration policy of the SDP, which turned out in hindsight to have been disastrous with the rise of Hitler in 1933. Now, in the terms of the post-war, what I call passive authoritarian liberalism, this begins with the story of depoliticization, demobilization of the masses, but also maybe a point which I didn't emphasize enough in my comment, which is the demise of class struggle. Again, most clearly in the German context, but it has counterparts in certainly in France. Italy is another story, perhaps, and that's something which I will have to take up with Marco on another occasion. But perhaps crucially, even the idea of constitutional rights as opposed to constituent power, this substitution of constitutional rights for constituent power, is part of this counter-revolutionary narrative. But of course, more fine-grained analyses can be told. And in response to Joanna's question, can it explain everything? Of course it can't. I mean, nothing can explain everything. And I don't, for example, say or tell the story of Spain or Portugal or other places too. So that would be for another occasion. In response to Bruce Ackerman, I largely agreed with much of what he said. In terms of my use of the constitutional moment, an expression comes to mind: don't try and teach granny how to suck eggs, which is what I risked doing by using the term in this paper. But I should have said that I didn't want to use it in an overly technical sense, but more of a colloquial sense. And of course, I agree that this is not something which happens in a week or two, but is something which requires a longer analysis. And of course, precisely because I don't think there was one, that doesn't sort of matter too much. But what struck me during the Euro crisis, in a sense, was what didn't happen. That was my overriding sense. Following this series of crises, both political, systemic, constitutional, anti-systemic, was the thing that didn't happen. With the exception, the interesting exception of Brexit, which of course no one predicted. And I quite agree that nothing is foreordained. I'm not convinced about placing Wall Street at the center. I mean, yes, in terms of the trigger, but to see why it had such a deep impact in Europe, we have to consider both the background, which is the growing financialization of the economy in the 1980s and the 1990s, and the constraints on the reaction. So the US was able to react much more decisively and quickly. And as you mentioned, that in Europe, that path was constantly blocked because of the ordoliberal constraints. And here I think Yuri's question is pertinent. Well, I say it's a question, it's more of a rhetorical question. Wasn't the Syriza referendum an example of over-politicization led by the illusion that you can vote the sovereign debt out of existence, the manifestation of political will, beating the laws of political economy? I mean, I love the expression. And the answer is yes, if you don't have the plan B. In other words, the political and economic capacity to exit, or at least for the threat of exit to be taken seriously by those with whom you are negotiating. Finally, and on the point of political economy in the 80s, I think Bojan makes a very good case for or account or explanation of the turn. But I just want to finish by mentioning something which is challenging, which is Bruce Ackerman's challenge to the sort of Eurocentrism of I think this whole panel, and that is a challenge. It's one that I've faced frequently when presenting my own work, and the argument often is, well, what about the importance of imperialism in the late 19th century, the decolonization in the 1950s, et cetera, and isn't this necessary to explain the whole material constitution, if you want to use that term? And yes, of course it does. And if we were to take seriously a full explanation, the role of the US, not only in the recent decades, but also from the Marshall Plan, this is something which has a significant impact right from the start of post-war integration. Yes, we would have to include a number of other more global factors, but what I try to do is, in a sense, limit the analysis to what is strictly required for the argument. Otherwise, everything becomes too global, too broad, too lost, if you like, in the mists of the global economy. And then, of course, we will be beaten by the laws of political economy, and Yuri will be proven right, whereas I hope Yuri will be proven wrong, namely that the manifestation of political will might still beat the laws of political economy. So in the end, I'm less of a pessimistic Marxist than you suspected. Thanks.
Good. Thanks, Mike. So I think some of the questions on the chat have actually been already addressed by the speakers. Definitely Martin's questions, it seems to me, have been addressed. Bojan's comments have been addressed. The second question by Giri has been addressed. I don't think the first one. So I'm going to report it, and then I will move to Signe's question. So the first question by Giri is for Mark and Agustin, which says, if they used to acquire tax-raising powers, how could this power be democratically legitimized? Marco or Agustin?
in the same way it is usually legitimized, so through the council and the parliament. The problem is that at the moment, to acquire tax raising powers, the need is also to acquire the ratifications by national parliaments. And we have seen that the process is almost completed, I think. And this, of course, poses important hurdles for managing in an easy way that process. Are we sure that this is a sufficient democratic legitimations? Not at all. Precisely for the reason I was mentioning before, because the EU political system is underdeveloped. And the moment in which you delegate highly salient political functions like taxation at that level, you risk to depoliticize those highly salient political functions, precisely because you do not have the required political system at that level.
May I briefly add to what Marco has said? But I think that's a pertinent question, but it's not the most urgent question regarding taxes. The most urgent question regarding taxes is that the power that can be exerted in common is used in order to recreate the capacity of the member states to tax efficiently. So the urgency is not to have federal taxes as such. The urgency, I'm not saying that I'm disregarding this possibility. I'm not entering into that. I'm saying that the most urgent thing is that instead of undermining national tax powers, the European Union becomes a force of recreating that powers. And here, the key question is free movement of capital. And this is the elephant in the room. Free movement of capital has to be re-regulated. Free movement of capital, and this is, there are many proposals out there. The people that work with Piketty, Gabriel Zuckman, Sais, that have been recently talking about the US system, but they have been also talking about the European system. This is the most urgent thing. And this requires a much more limited legitimacy on the side of the European Union, because it will not be taxing itself. The question basically is that there is no political willingness in order to do that, because the result of the four economic freedoms is precisely that it allows some member states to run tax systems that basically beggar the neighbor. And this is not only the case of Luxembourg, which is evident, but is the case of many other states, which basically are tax havens within the European Union. That's it.
Now, let me read Signe's question to Bruce Ackerman and to Mike. If we accept that the EU is already a federation/federal union, what are your views of Hayek's analysis of the bias of the economic constitution of a federation? I wonder who wants to go first.
Agustin, I will be talking about this in my 30 minutes. So I think that
Mike?
I'm more than happy to wait for Bruce's response. I would say that, just briefly, that it seems rather prescient, Hayek's views, unfortunately prescient, not because I'm a Hayekian, but because we have to understand the terrain. In some ways, I say it's a more a question that I would throw back to Signe, given that she is the expert on the federation. But yes, I think we can learn quite a lot. And in fact, someone mentioned earlier Fritz Scharpf, who begins his paper on the asymmetries of European integration and why the EU cannot be a social market economy by precisely noting the significance of Hayek's claims about the difficulties of establishing a social democracy at the federal level. Of course, if in Hayek's view, that's precisely a good thing, and why the economic federation should be pursued. It may be worth noting it wasn't only Hayek, but of course also Lionel Robbins, who in the 30s and 40s argued a similar case. But I'm happy to wait, to return to that question when Bruce answers later.
Okay, good. So if there is no other question, and it seems to me that I've checked the chat, there seems not to be other questions, I would proceed actually to give the floor to Bruce Ackerman for his conclusions. Bruce.
Well, let me begin with a personal note about Fritz Sharp, who was teaching at Yale when I was a student. And he blew my mind. I had been entirely, as any American brought up under hegemonic American premises, I'd never even thought about this before. And for good or bad, a good deal of what I had, this particular movement of mine began with Hayek and then continued with my colleagues when I returned, Juan Lintz and who also opened up my mind to these issues and fascinating discussions that I had with him for many years. But now let's begin, I think, with some fundamentals of democratic theory. In a democracy, we expect different political parties to disagree. And there will be, in a healthy democracy, some people who take right-wing views, some people who take left-wing views, then centrist views, left center, right center. And they will compete with one another. Okay. And who, rather than having a consensus or anything resembling a consensus, who is going to govern? Answer, we look to elections, right? Now, it is a fundamental mistake from democratic theory to say that classical liberals, I'm not talking about Hayekians right now, but we could put Hayekians as part of classical liberals, are the same as totalitarians. What a totalitarian movement is one that wants to destroy the legitimacy of democratic elections. So a fundamental dimension of constitutionalism is first, there are two different dimensions. First, how to preserve free and fair elections. First, by preventing the destruction and crushing of political parties that are not trying to crush the democratic system. To establish conditions of free and fair discourse ongoing challenges by the people who have lost the last election to the direction of that the people who have won the last election saying, you're wrong, we should go a different way, right? So free and fair elections and counting the votes and facilitating voting and counting the votes with integrity, professional, bureaucratic integrity. Have it as depoliticized as possible. That's a necessary condition for democracy. Next, we then have to structure the system of power of the movements and parties that win. Should there be a single parliament, parliamentary chamber? Or should there be two parliamentary chambers? Right? If you say there should be two, it makes it much more difficult to get legislation through. But on the other hand, maybe that's a good thing if the last political election showed a very thin majority, 52 to 48. No, you should have a single parliament. What happens if the parliament, however organized, legislates in ways, whether it be through some piece of paper called the Constitution or statutes or whatever, in ways that destroy the preconditions of democracy? Should the court or some other juridical institution intervene to protect democracy? Well, there are no easy answers to these questions. There are dangers all the time. There's no single answer to this question, but these questions are fundamental to institutional design for ongoing democracy. And I want to distinguish these questions. Another question. Should we have a proportional representation system or first past the post system? Except for the British and the Americans, the answer very sensibly is some form of proportional representation. What form? Should there be a 7.5% threshold? If a party doesn't make it, then it should not be represented. Well, that encourages coordination of parties. On the other hand, it can lead to a situation as in Poland, where Kaczynski wins with 38% of the vote, but because the opposition is split, several of them don't make the 7.5, whatever the threshold is. I don't want to, so he gets 50% of the vote of the seats. On the other hand, if we say there should be no threshold, then we have obvious fragmentation problems. Okay, so that structure is fundamental to be taken seriously as a matter of democratic principle. When we talk about communists, that's the totally. I mean, that's just much too vague a term. There are strong social democrats who want to nationalize Mitterrand, who want to nationalize. By the way, Augustine, I appreciate your remarks. Of course, I talk about all of your episodes at length in my book, and I thank you for encouraging the viewers to read the chapter, and because I have answers to your points. But let's go back to the key thing. This is as the foundations of constitutional democracy. Now, what I define as a foundation of democracy, then my commitment is to a system which does not, and that was very much what we were talking about yesterday, to a system in which simply by winning a single election, the political parties who win can destroy the system. And that's a foundational element which is not to be pushed aside as technocratic or legalist, but foundational. Okay, then we go to the next move, which is dualism. Should the system be organized in a way which gives special importance to the self-conscious mobilization of movement parties? Ackerman says yes, but more significantly than Ackerman saying yes, this, I argue in my 3 volumes in We the People, is the operational, evolutionary, transformative structure of American constitutionalism. With, as is pointed out, Franklin Roosevelt actually understanding himself to be heavily indebted to Mussolini. His New Deal is very self-consciously modeled on the corporatist notion that capital and labor should organize industry, as opposed to communism on the one hand, which says, we mean capital and labor. No. And as opposed to classical liberalism. And until Mussolini in 1937 or 8, whatever, embraces Hitler, Roosevelt, and there's enormous correspondence to this effect. And I mean, this is not an embarrassment for Roosevelt, is an admirer of the Stato Nuovo. And so you're quite right in thinking that after the New Deal, after the war, it isn't that Europe is the New Deal is with the Marshall Plan expressing this commitment to a welfare state with a mobilized capital and labor. Moreover, and here is the next generation is not the repudiation of the New Deal in the United States, but its generalization in the civil rights movement, that Blacks and women should be, there's this Enlightenment ideal inherited from the Civil War, but Blacks and women should be included within this. And as Mike was suggesting, this constituent power of the state should be deployed on behalf of the realization of genuine freedom. Okay, now so one very striking, so that's it is only Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher who challenge this notion that, of course, is also in British politics. Once again, a battle between the Conservatives and the Labour Party. It isn't that the Labour Party is reactionary unless you say that they're really autocrats. Well, that's your opinion. You know, I have an opinion too. I happen to be, in American terms, a social democrat, and a strong one. I'm not trying to tell you what's right. I'm trying to describe the problem of constitutionalism. Now the crucial point, which is a very big difference between the US and the European Union at the present time, and I quite agree with you, is that the left in Europe is disintegrated. The left in the United States is mobilized thanks to Trump. And that's a fundamental difference. However, it is false to say that there are no movement parties in Europe. What are the Greens? They're a movement party in the Ackermanian sense of the term. What is the Alternative für Deutschland? That is a movement party, mobilized, self-conscious. Now, what we have in Europe, in what we have in America, is, however, one should not exaggerate the percentage of the population that is committed to these movements. Trumpism on the one hand, whatever that is, we'll leave it undefined at the moment, or what AOC or strong social democracy is on the left. If we actually look at the distribution of commitment, there is 15, 20% Alternative für Deutschland. You can 20%, maybe 25% Green. The two old hegemonic parties who are different from one another, Social Democrats and Christian Democrats, are only now have 60% of the vote. Incredible. But that doesn't mean that they don't exist as 60%. There are still centrists, left centrists, right centrists, we could characterize them anyway, who are, oh my God, what's going on? Angela Merkel is great because she's, whatever she isn't one of those things. Now, the same thing is true in France, in Italy, we can in Spain. There are movements, but none of them are 51%. Command 51% of the vote. So the anxiety is, and I think it is a legitimate anxiety, that a movement with self-conscious mobilized support, a movement party of 20%, doesn't exploit the contingencies of a depression, a COVID, or whatever, any number of contingencies, and get 51% and then destroy the constitutional structure. Okay. Now we move to the final part that I'm going to emphasize right now, and that is called federalism. And there are two key dimensions here. One, there is this complaint that what the union is an effort by one or another set of countries to appropriate money from other countries, other member states, right? That is been happening in the United States since the beginning of time. In any federal system, if there are, what a federal system is there's a political system on the level of the member state and a political system at the level of the center. And there's some way in which people from a place called Texas or Germany want to, who are politicians and or leaders of political movements, want to leverage their position in Germany or Italy and become big timers on the federal level, right? Because they want to be president of the commission one day. There's nothing wrong with that. That's what politicians believe themselves, that they're on the right track to whichever it is. That's why they've chosen politics as a profession, as one might say with a bow to Weber. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Now, when we have movement parties, it's even better, because my contribution to this comparative work is precisely to emphasize the centrality of movement parties. So of course, if the next prime minister of Germany is a Green, there's nothing wrong with her wanting to become president of the commission 10 years from now. And she should, of course, take Germany's interests into account. Otherwise, the Green Party in Germany will repudiate her. Because it isn't true that the German Greens are have the same priorities as the Greens in Holland, although they converge. So this problem of member states trying to use their people in the central government, however organized, to bring home to bring agricultural subsidies home and things of this kind. This is, you should really look at 150 books describing this process in the United States over time. The answer, however, and this is what I want to very much reject, is not to destroy the capacity of the European Union or the United States to actually restructure things so as to reward the selection of politicians, movement politicians or ordinary politicians, who are taking in the general interests of the Union seriously. How will that occur? Well, that's the question. But for sure, the answer is not to simply look upon the European, the Lisbon Treaty as the Constitution of Europe. The Lisbon Treaty is not the Constitution of Europe, right? And indeed, as Mike was pointing out, it has been violated, in Greece, transparently. Take the, is there any, if this is just a treaty, right? What does this stop member states from, a subset of member states from signing a different treaty? Generally speaking, if it's only a treaty. the latter treaty is superior to the former treaty, right? Okay, but this is already, that's legalism, and I'm not interested in legalism, I'm just pointing it out. What we already have is a system of increasing parliamentary democracy in Europe. One striking omission from the accounts that I've heard is the construction of the European Parliament in the 1970s. This was the first step to direct democracy in Europe. First step, and it was self-consciously understood to be the first step. Right? Now, when we go to we've had many steps since then, but fundamentally, the most important steps recently have been the creation of European political parties. And the failure the last time, but the time before, of the principle that European elections should be on a different agenda from national elections, and that the European, the leader of the European party that gets the most votes should have the first right to form a coalition in the European Parliament. Right? That is the system which this time was undermined by the selection of a German. So we have a German-dominated institution, the European Central Bank, and a German representing the Commission. She's fine, first rate. I'm not complaining about her own seriousness. While this Portuguese guy is running around saying, I'm really chief. Portugal, come on. Obviously, you're not really chief. You can say you are, but you're not. And this most recent agreement to transfer is an expression of this. All right, now, two final points here. One is if you basically, I have been hearing Marco and Augustin write speeches for Marine Le Pen. If she were to, because of course she's not getting out of the euro right now, et cetera, and so forth. We have to take back control of the movement of capital into France. This classical neoliberal, who is absolutely, it's not my politics at all. Macron is not, neoliberals are bad. He is not even a Hayek by any stretch of the imagination. You see, one of my difficulties with the commentators generally, but especially today, is that you are talking about other commentators. Notice, I'm talking about what political existence is actually like. I'm not talking about Hayek. I'm talking about Le Pen. I'm talking about I'm talking about Macron. If Macron loses on the second round of the election because the left is so split that Le Pen is going to finish second and Macron isn't going to get 51% of the vote, and Macron fails for any number of reasons, what do we have? Well, this returns us to my remarks of the beginning. What we will have is a Europe dominated by Putin. Here is Marine Le Pen, who is, of course, the last person who anyone will trust to have an army, European army, under French generals. No way. And of course, for obvious reasons, they can't be German generals. So that's it. Instead, we have this precious opportunity. Europe has a precious opportunity for leadership. And this, as my last point, notice just yesterday, Biden has continued the Trump policy and has repudiated the Open Skies Treaty, which over European objection, which permits actually monitoring the troops that Putin may or may not use in his threats to Finland, to et cetera and so forth. Biden has continued Trump. Biden, however, is in tremendous, it's in his political advantage greatly to affirm the transatlantic alliance. Because, as I mentioned, there are hundreds of millions of Americans who have family in Europe, and for whom this is an important foreign policy. Mostly Americans, as this conversation shows in Europe, are American-centered. What they're concerned about is whether they're going to get a job after this crisis ends and things of this kind. But all of these people know what's going on in Europe. This is a dramatic demonstration of Biden yesterday, that without European leadership right now in proposing a reorganization of NATO in which over the next 5 years, they will defend Danzig while the US has some troops and will provide the military, air power, et cetera, and so forth, but that it will be Europeans who will die for Danzig. The risks of a Europe in which the European commissions and the system of European parties disintegrates as a result by the kind of anti-capitalist nationalism of the Le Pens in favor of centralized French control of their own industries will be greatly enhanced, and Europe will become the plaything of Putin, who will, and with great popular esteem and support, reassert Russian influence over Eastern Europe. And with Nord Stream 2 and things of this kind, manipulate the Germans. Is that really what you want? Well, this has been a great conversation for me. This is not going to be a central point when the book comes out, because after all, maybe we'll see what will happen in the next few elections in Germany, in France, in the United States. The idea that we know what will happen is ridiculous. The idea that there will be a few people who 20 years from now will say, aha, Ackerman was wrong, or maybe, God forbid, Ackerman is right. the tragedy is that my prediction of the decline and fall of the American Republic book of 2010, for the last, the press has been selling a huge number of copies since Trump came in, because although I didn't predict a Trump, I did predict something that could be like Trump, except by a leader who could think. And unfortunately, the next election will be, could well be in the United States, a Republican Party dominated by extremists, led by someone who is a Trump person, but not Trump, and will have the feature that he's highly intelligent and can think. This will be the beginning of the dark age of constitutionalism, democratic constitutionalism in the West.
Great.
Sorry to end on such a grim note.
You ended on a very sobering note, I must say.
Yes.
And also, I must say, unfortunately, because of time, your conclusions were also quite provoking, in particular, I guess, for the speakers. But we really have to wrap it up, also because probably we don't want to abuse the patience of our audience. It is already 6:41 here in Europe. I think it is time to basically wrap up these 5 days. They've been very intense. They've been very rich. We want to thank all the participants, all the speakers. Well, we want to thank, first of all, Bruce Ackerman, who has engaged throughout all the 5 days. And then, of course, all the people in the audience. I would like also now to pass and give the floor to Marco Dani, probably on behalf of actually the real hosting institution of the event.
Thank you, Marco. Just a few words to thank all the participants, first of all, because I think it was quite ambitious for us to attract the people and to have them for all these 5 days, but I think we have been quite successful in that regard. I would like then to thank Professor Bruce Ackerman, who has been so generous with us to share with us his views, his comments, to read our papers, to engage in a conversation. This was not granted, and we are thankful for this. And finally, let me thank also the speakers and the discussants of all these days, because they have been extremely enriching in their contributions. And just on behalf of my institution, the Faculty of Law of Trento, I would like to greet everyone. There have been questions about the papers. The papers were submitted just for this discussion. They are not ready to be circulated outside, but hopefully will be ready sometime soon to have them published. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I really can't understate how much I've learned from this conversation. I really am terribly grateful.
Thanks to you, Bruce. I mean, can I add just, I think we need to also to thank both the University of Trento and obviously the staff who have helped us in organizing this event. I think we can actually come to a conclusion. And thanks again, everyone else. Thanks for your engagement. It has been really, really great for us. And we will be in touch later. We will rest a bit now, and then we will be in touch with the speakers and the discussants with our future plans. Great. See you all soon.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Ciao.